So welcome to this afternoon session. As you know, the title is Human Science and the Challenge of the Cultural Paradigms. So first of all, I want to welcome, a warm welcome to Professor Zavaroni, who is here, but also to Professor Zolito, Melino, and Camozzi, professor who are connected online. I will introduce them personally before the respective papers. I think that all of us, we know that during the whole of the 20th century, what was gradually consolidated in human science and especially in anthropology, the awareness that there are several ways of being in the world, and so different ways of being men and women religious. It was a slow process, not without cultural misunderstandings, and I think its development also is submitted to new developments in this new century. So the knowledge and the encounter with other cultural worlds caused a rethinking of our own visions of otherness, triggering a double process that is still in progress. On the one hand, a process of decolonization of imagination, through which were represented and are still represented cultures that are different than the culture we belong to, one belongs to. And on the other hand, an attempt of self-understanding of our belonging to the world and to religious belonging. So from different perspectives, today's papers will offer an important contribution on the meaning of what is it to be and become humane in a multicultural context, and how multiculturality calls in question the different human sciences. So after this morning session, this afternoon session will take place in 3 stages. First of all, the papers of our speakers, and I ask them to keep them into 15 minutes. And then a second stage is a short conversation, dialogue between the speakers themselves. In anthropology, we are used to make connections. So if we can make connections also with the other contributions that will be proposed by the speakers, that would be good. And then a third moment, if you have time, will be consecrated to a dialogue among us with all the participants. So I hope that Professor Zolito is already online, connected online, and I will introduce him, Professor Davide Zolito. He is Associate Professor of General and Social Pedagogy at the University of Udine. His main areas of research are intercultural pedagogy, educational theory, and pedagogical research in heterogeneous contexts, including child and youth cultures, and the perspectives of cultural and post-colonial studies. Recent publications, I want to mention, From Interculture to Heterogeneous Context, Theoretical Presuppositions and Areas of Pedagogical Research, and another book in 2020, starting from the points of strength, popular culture, heterogeneity, and education. Then the title of his paper, the paper of Professor Zolito, is to be trained together to pedagogical research in context characterized by high sociocultural complexity. So, Professor Zolito, I give you the floor. So, good afternoon or good morning or good evening to everyone. I hope you can hear me well. So, first of all, my thanks, non-formal gratitude to the organizers, to Professor Pandolfi and all the colleagues for this opportunity to propose some parts of the pathways pushed up with other segments, so provisional pathways with which we wanted to face situations that we live on a daily basis. So this is a precious opportunity to share this part of the afternoon with the colleagues. I think of specifically to Professor Melino. We had opportunity to work together in the past. So I hope I can share the screen with you. I hope that everything will work properly. So please tell me if you can watch my slides. So I thought of organizing this fragment of reflection around some points. The title, to get trained together in pedagogical research. The key points are together and research. So, a community, plurilinguistic, plurilanguage community is difficult to be defined, but it is something that has to do with a non-closed pathway, with something that involves more people in cooperation, in team, and the work in educational context that is necessarily faced with some aspects that I will share. So the first part will be more focused on more theoretical, epistemological presuppositions, assumptions, while in the second part I try to draw from these theoretical points some possible working pathways, especially in educators and teachers pathway. So within high complexity context. Many words seem more respectful of the great complexity of the context and pathways that I want to analyze. So the context of formation today, I'm a pedagogist, so my reflection is based on this topic of the educational context and the search for the common ground. So today's context of formation are characterized by a great diversity, heterogeneity, that very hardly can be, we can use a single reading key. So with a simplifying approach is always the temptation around the corner. I have been working in this for many years, and I realize nearly every day of how dangerous is the risk of simplifying and schematize a series of elements that in our daily life come up in totally interwoven. Also words like multicultural, intercultural could in turn hide the danger of an approach that prefers the cultural reading key. We don't have time to analyze these details, but I want to share the point where I am. So this heterogeneity is made of a repertoire of pathways. It is made of nuances, of going beyond the borders of between different areas in context marked by asymmetrical relations that are the fruit of historical periods, especially present, that is not characterized by fairness concerning these all the processes and people involved. But this heterogeneity and complexity is refers to many aspects. The people in context of formation, also where formators are trained, have different backgrounds, different language backgrounds, cultural background, because repertoire are something more articulated, and they are characterized by also by generational gaps. Also the topic of gender difference, and also the important topic of the socioeconomic aspects. So all those elements that are, we can see them in our daily life, in the places of education, places of training. So the perspective that is very precious today is the so-called intersectionality. Intersectionality is this perspective that was born in the women's studies in the US and then spread in many other contexts. So intersectionality means that our pathways of life and training do not take place within differences that are pre-existence, but they are intersections of different elements. So even the difference that we see in educational pathways, and much of the philosophy of last century showed it, it is not made of essences, but about relations. So what is the difference? It is always a relationship. So in this perspective, the issue of intersection is important because it helps us to grasp the specific characters, the point of strength of this approach. But while we emphasize the relational aspect, we should not forget the other aspect of intersectionality. That is the fact that these intersections come out in contexts that are never neutral, but they are charged with asymmetrical relations. So I was thinking also of the colonial time that marked this in a very strong way. And also the contemporary world, I think of the concept of post-colony. So difference has a relationship in a dynamic way, but they come out from context marked by differences of power in the last century. So a suggestion, we are always in the field of other that mark the asymmetrical relations, where there are elements that tend to frame things and others that enable cross-analysis and enable us to express the specific features of people. So point of departure is heterogeneity that starts from intersections. These intersections are dynamic. So heterogeneity of these interactions that remain in context like those referring to center and periphery. Please wait a moment, the technicians are going to settle this problem. Please switch off your mobile phone and maybe you can continue now. So thinking of the metaphor of actualizations, the creole dynamics are interesting, but also marked by a strong relationship between center and periphery, because educational contexts are contexts where there are the sections, institutions that cannot crystallize. So I think this topic is the introduction, also, especially for formators. So an approach of pedagogical research that takes into account this complexity, so that could be inspired to a post-colonial criticism, takes the distance from the epistemological assumptions coming out from these colonial distorted relations that condition our way to see the relationship with others and also the words we use. Here an author on which Professor Melino has been working a lot and wrote many pages, reminds us how there is an inevitable dangerous trend in the colonial time to build, represent the world in a binary way, we and them, with a stereotypical construction that does not take into account the concrete aspect of these pathways. And especially in the educational area, this binary construction of the relationship we and them is associated to the idea that they are those who have to are always to be helped, to be corrected, to be civilized. So, and Slater wrote many important pages about this. So this imbalance is always very dangerous. So I summarized these. These are the epistemological assumptions that we want to analyze because they continue to influence other way to approach the educational context of educators. So how can we see this in the educational field? For example, from the time of Paulo Freire, that some of these tracks are really present and visible, especially thinking that the person with whom we are working, that we are forming and who is forming himself or herself with us, and this person can be seen as a tabula rasa, so something that I don't only have to fill the gap. So this perspective is very much present today. I perceive today as a risk. So the idea that I have in front of me a white sheet, but it's never a white sheet. These are the crossings I was talking about that are charged with responsibilities, and without them we cannot construct anything. Furthermore, the other risk we have to face is that of not grasping, not understanding, and using a metaphor that anthropologists write a lot, not to see the water where we are swimming. So these contexts are made of culture, they are historically built, and this does not mean that they're not meaningful, but sometimes you cannot see their cultural features. We don't see everything that is so daily that it becomes transparent, but this is a problem at least for two reasons. On the one hand, because we don't grasp all the areas where this approach that can become an obstacle in the construction of the community of formation. And at the same time, we don't grasp the potentiality of these. We simply don't see. There is a blind point. And also the post-colonial thought goes along this line, because if we only see the vision of others, everything that concerns ourselves disappears, both when it is meaningful and when it creates obstacles. So how can we act concretely? What tracks can we follow to keep aware in front of this risk, and especially make it sustainable and they can be declined in some way, articulate in some way? You can imagine some tracks on which we can work. So first of all, to get trained as formators of formators and researchers, and read the complexity and intersections and avoid all forms of weak thought. So I want to focus the attention on what we have in common, on the intersections, on everything that comes out in the relationship without polarizing, without splitting the relationship. This is an issue on which there is much literature. This is a first track. The second track is to value the features that come out in context where we are already working. I beg your pardon.
Dovrebbe chiudere completamente il telefono.
Chiudo con questi ultimi due spunti.
Chiudere il telefono. Chiudere il telefono.
Ma è chiuso, era lontano, era l'avviso che doveva finire il tempo.
Sì.
Valorizzare le caratteristiche.
So to value the features of heterogeneity within the context of formation. Our classes with which we are trained are more and more often full of these aspects. They are plurilinguistic, and so we should thematize this plurilinguism, this richness, and treasurize it in the moments of training. But this is connected to this binary thought, so that would prevent us from seeing the important differences. And we should be able to see the plurality which are within our tradition and within the other traditions. I use the word tradition in a significant way, because if we say that the education institutions are influenced by the narration and culture, we have to be able to see and talk to them. And this is very relevant. Otherwise, we get trained unwittingly in one kind of speech. And then we can see what consequences with this different different approach have in a concrete way. The construction of curricula, the learning systems, the way we propose syllabus, texts. So the whole analysis with the for me is of the cultural influences in the context of training and formation. And this would enable us to, I don't say to reverse, because it's not possible, but to enlarge our vision and see all the points of strength that are present within the classes of formators, and start from these points of strength, which are not only those of the people to be trained, but also of the institutions. So I would go back to the whole setting from which I started. So the key topic is the word community. So with all the problems that are connected to this world. But if we see the context of formation of formators as the one where there are many points of view, then we can enlarge our vision and we can look at ourselves from outside, so that these external observation from the eyes of those who are formed by us can see all the implicit topics, and enables us to remain much rooted in the context, but also capable of having a vision that is also external in a way. So this is an antinomy, so the capacity to look at things in two ways, to be very close to the pathways of the people we work with, but at the same time have a critical vision that enables us, together with them, to build situations to remain in this complexity. Thank you very much for this presentation, where, as you observed, you emphasized the intersection, especially the complexity of this formation, this training in which we should be inserted.
We will have more time right after the presentations and the lectures from our panelists to perhaps linger on what has been said during our session. But I would like to move on to Professor Miguel Melino. He is a lecturer in post-colonial studies and inter-ethnic relationships at the L'Orientale University of Naples. Professor Melino is a researcher in the Department of Human and Social Sciences. He's professor of cultural anthropology and post-colonial studies and interethnic relations. He has been a visiting lecturer in Milan, Pisa, Rome, and Reggio Calabria, and also in foreign countries, Buenos Aires, Liverpool, and London. Professor Melino wrote many books on post-colonial issues and cultural studies. The title of his contribution today is From Colonialism to Coloniality: Challenges and Risks of Post-Colonial Views and Decolonization of Knowledge. Professor, I would like to give you the floor. Yes, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon to you all. First of all, I wanted to thank Luca and the organizers for having invited me to talk to you and with you about these subjects. I kind of had an inkling of what Davide would say during his contribution, because we have known each other for a long time. So I imagine my contribution as a follow-up to his lecture, so that I would not repeat many of the things he has so eloquently described and that we all share. In my contribution, having in mind many of the things that Davide has outlined, as an approach to what he called the inherent heterogeneity of Italian society. So I would like to talk about an intercultural approach, as he defined it, but I would rather call this as an anti-racist approach or anti-racist pedagogy, because I believe that this should be the aspect that should be emphasized rather than interculturality and then multiculturalism. Because it seems to me that the way in which, in a way, these topics have been addressed in public discourse, when we think about also education pathways, the idea, the notion of intercultural, this is something that should be questioned, perhaps, in a way. And in the next 15 to 20 minutes, I will try to explain why. To basically make it easier for you to understand what I will say, you just have to remember what Davide said. But what I will do is that I will open even more the categories that he suggested, trying to expand the context, trying to see what are the social and political and cultural and public contexts within which we can or we imagine that we can work with that specific approach that we think is right in a situation that is made up by multi-ethnicity or heterogeneity, multiculturalism, whatever you may call it. So I will try to describe to you, or rather, I would like to elaborate on some of the things Davide mentioned already pertaining to what I've been doing in my work, so post-colonial and decolonial approaches in cultural studies, and the entire tradition of let's say, African American, Black, or Caribbean or third world thinking that is related to these issues. But I will try to do so not just by listing a number of concepts and providing you a conceptual grid through which we can interpret reality. No, so I will not do this, let's say, with a top-down approach from theory, but I will try to see what tools these approaches have given to me and to us in our work to address the questions that we have been trying to answer during this conference. So to stay within the 20 minutes range, I have set, let's say, a roadmap for myself, and I will read a little bit my text, and sometimes I will instead elaborate further on what I'm reading. As usual, considering the limited time we have to talk about these topics, I believe that we should start from the title. The containers that have been identified to frame our contributions, to also start asking some questions related to my title. I would like to start from the titles you have chosen for the different sessions to try and see with you what these titles implicitly suggest to us. We have two. The broader title, multicultural communities for what kind of formation, and here Davide has already made a few comments, and I will also share my views on this. And then the second topic that's specific to our panel, human sciences and the challenge of the different cultural paradigms. Let us begin by saying something about the first and the general title as a starting point for my speech. It is not very clear to me what the expression multicultural communities refers to, what it implies. In linguistic terms, I cannot really identify, and I would like to discuss this with you, I cannot really identify what semiotics or experts in linguistics, post-structuralists, if we want to call them this way, who in part, they are at the roots of post-colonial studies that I have dedicated my life to and that I'm trying to convey to you. So they're not able to identify the position of the subject who is uttering this word, the uttering subject. So what is the stance that we would like to take when we want to talk about multicultural communities and formation? I believe we have to focus a little bit more on what we're trying to say. I would be more inclined to say societies and not communities, multicultural societies. I'm thinking about an initial interpretation of what we mean when we talk about multicultural communities. Are we talking about Italy as a society, the communities that make up Italian society? So these are already two different things. But I'm more inclined to talk about societies and not communities in this case. But perhaps here we already have an interpretation, right? Rather than a neutral container, because a community is not a neutral container or framework. And the fact that this is not being indicated as a neutral framework would have nothing wrong with this. It would just have to be a little bit more specific. However, it is difficult for me to think of multicultural communities as a concept. Post-colonialists, they would say transcultural or even post-colonial. So transcultural or post-colonial communities. Decolonialists would say intercultural communities. But none of these two approaches would use multicultural. I'm not here to say who's right and who's wrong. I want to understand what is behind these concepts. Why would postcolonial and the postcolonialists and decolonialists would use a transcultural or intercultural? They would do so in order to break the cultural boundary that the idea of multicultural carries with it anyway, and thus to set as a starting point the cultural fluidity, hybridization that would come to characterize the existential, subjective, and cultural condition of our time and age. That applies to everyone, not just to migrant communities or post-migrant communities or other quote-unquote communities. And this already is a way to decolonize our vision, because talking about hybridization of all the small mosaics that make up a specific area or geographical space is already something different compared to the way in which multiculturalism was presented in the past. But we should ask ourselves also, and trying to focus a little bit more, what social situation is this concept trying to make visible, the concept of multicultural communities, what it does suggest. Let's engage in a Said-like operation. If you go and check out some of the interviews you find on the internet where Edward Said explained his Orientalism and cultural imperialism, Said wonders, well, if I say the East, the Orient, what comes to your mind spontaneously? Camels, deserts, terrorism, tyrants. Let's engage in an operation of this kind. If I say multicultural community, what comes to your mind? I repeat once again, it might bring to my mind, I mean, it's not that clear, but it make me think about a multi-ethnic neighborhood, perhaps. Or instead, as I was saying earlier, here, community is a neutral concept, a mere, let's say, replacement for society, which means Italy. And this is something that we have to make clear. Or perhaps, as is actually the case, it just refers to ethnical and cultural communities, different ones that live together. So an area where different communities live, including the Italian community, because from the title it's not clear whether the local community is included, and they necessarily have a multicultural background or projection, considering the inherent multi-ethnic nature of Italian society in many of its micro-physical, let's say, contexts. Let's take this term from Michel Foucault. So to attach multiculturalism to something that is tangible and real, quote unquote. But here too, if we want to try and see what problem are there really multicultural communities in Italy, there's something I ask myself when I listen to the public discourse, to academic discourse, when I read newspapers. This is what I wonder about. Are there any multicultural communities in Italy beyond associations that term themselves, style themselves as such, or labels that we see everywhere? Because normally what we mean by cultural community meant as other, let's say, communities. These are they're not really interlocutors. They're communities that we speak to. They do not engage in a dialogue. And quite often the subjects who are part of these so-called communities are being seen as an opposing, let's say, pole, either as criminals or as needy people or as the bearers of an element of democracy or multiculturalism in Italian society. Now, beyond these three possibilities, I believe that this is a highly desubjectivizing strategy in the way in which we deal with everything that pertains to these communities in our national context here in Italy. Because if we want to then place everything that Davide said earlier would be the right approach to these issues, we should also add that Italy is a country that has a hard time in seeing itself as a multi-ethnic society. It is very hard, starting from public discourse. I'm not saying that it's hard for Italy, who knows where. Someone has repeated quite often that most migrants who were able to express their voices in the last 10 to 15 years and have changed the situation a little bit, well, these individuals, these migrant subjects, this, let's say, alien bodies, as we find in a title that was published recently by an Italian-Nigerian author, a writer. Her name is Owa Suji. So these alien bodies, these foreign bodies are, let's say, constructed and identified, but they are never involved in a dialogue to build together a public culture. So this is the first problem I see here. The fact that we have the migrants, let's say, and post-migrants or foreigners who live within the Italian population, who, however, are not recognized within public discourse by public culture, and when they're recognized, they are reified or objectified within the categories that I mentioned earlier, or also within other categories. So let us work on what this concept of multicultural community would like to then express or show. Multicultural, in the way in which it has been chosen by you to engage in dialogue, probably it has been chosen for a brotherly coexistence to represent this. Or it can perhaps use a term that was introduced by one of the best-known authors in the studies, Black post-colonial studies, called intercultural conviviality. So a multicultural community, in a way, could stand for intercultural conviviality. So why did I opt for this strategy? I would like to say this from the very beginning, because from my standpoint, then challenging the concepts that we use and that we take for granted as if the meaning that they convey was almost attached to the concept itself, whereas we know that this is not the case, because concepts, as amongst many others, two French philosophers such as Gilles Deleuze, Félix Guattari in What is Philosophy? So concepts are epistemological and philosophical concepts and constructs. So they're not sitting there in society. They are epistemological and philosophical creations, let's say, that are trying to make a situation visible, which otherwise would be covert or hidden. It would not be easy to visualize. I'm saying this because challenging concepts seems to me the first necessary step to think about the second part of the title that you gave to this conference. For what formation? For what formation? The idea, let's say, or this question basically implies a situation of crisis in formation. We feel like something is missing there, and if we want to basically express this in philosophical terms, we might say that wondering about formation means that there is, let's say, a clearing that has formed, as Heidegger said, in the way in which we think about the world. There's something that's missing. We feel incomplete when we look at the subject matter that we have to analyze. But the interesting thing is not going to look for labels to try to define things, but try to challenge things even more so that we can find a more effective reply to this question. I would like to ask myself, what has opened up this clearing in the forest, right? Why is this concept of formation in a crisis now? And Jacques Lacan, a very famous analyst, said what has generated a hole, a vacuum in our language. And he believes that this is a good thing because this hole, this vacuum, uproots us in a way. And once we are uprooted, we understand our subjectivity as such, and we wonder what the world is all about. We are starting to denaturalize the world. Otherwise, we live in a kind of world that is natural, where nothing is being challenged, or basically accepting and taking for granted what these concepts are meant to express. So I'm wondering how this clearance, this lack, this vacuum has formed, whereby we have felt the need to basically question our beliefs regarding this feature of Italian society and European society, which is multiculturalism. So what is wrong in our formation? We heard that it's not good compared to 15 years ago. I would say, and this is my personal view, these subjects have made their voices heard, and this has challenged most concepts and outlooks on these things even more, starting from which most of the world of knowledge, academia, the public and political discourse, kept speaking of them in these terms, that they have been challenging. So if we want to think about formation, in my view, we have to start denaturalizing our toolkit, our toolbox, which means the concepts, the public culture and the language through which then are being spoken to, according to a semiologist. He wrote many important books. Roland Barthes, Fragments of Amorous Discourse. We are being spoken to by our language, he used to say. And this is a problem because when we have to speak, we have to use something that is outside of ourselves and which gives rise to challenges. He considered this in relation to love in this text. That we will not get into this topic, although love would be perhaps relevant regarding what we're talking about, love towards the other. Love is openness towards other. Fanon mentions this in his Black Skin, White Masks. But closer to home, perhaps, we have to think about the post-colonial translation or decolonial translation that was given by Gattrasi Spriga and Frantz Fanon. Remember the title of his first text, Black Skin, White Masks. What does this notion of spoken language mean as seen by Fanon, Spivak, and Quijano? Let's think about Fanon as if black subjects are subjectively built and they're spoken to by white racial and colonial culture. They perceive themselves through this lens that presents itself as being objective, but it's just one of the most effective tools of colonial domination. Spivak first and Fanon later said something that's very useful to think about our formation, which is the following, that the language and the modern culture, and therefore modern knowledge, whose raw material is the culture of language. This is one of the most important legacies that we can take from Said's work. The fact that knowledge, or different forms of knowledge, they're not outside of culture and language, but they're within culture and language and are expressed through language and culture. Especially if we think about the subject matters that we're dealing with, human sciences, social sciences, philosophical approaches, and so on and so forth. Therefore, Professor, I'm sorry. Well, modern language and modern culture are part of our culture and language, so they're not anything neutral, nor is language. And also the langue and parole, language in these terms, they're not neutral. Bourdieu said so. He used to speak about the langue and the parole and the culture as a kind of symbolic violence vis-a-vis the subject. Why? Because it used to present an arbitrary world as something that was objective and natural. Post-colonialists and decolonialists have further challenged these neutral notions or political notions, such as the ones suggested by Bourdieu, adding an aspect that is more interesting, I believe, or equally interesting, the fact that culture, language, and modern language, they're not mere tools for domination, but they are characterized and pervaded by something that important scholar Quijano has called for the last decades coloniality. Our language, our culture, our knowledge are pervaded by coloniality, by a residual of coloniality. Residual coloniality, and I would like to explain to you what he meant. No, I'm sorry, Professor. You should wrap up, actually. Could you please actually draw some conclusions, because then we will have some time for perhaps a debate. Thank you. I do not know really how to wrap up because I didn't realize that I've been speaking for 15 minutes. No, well, it's been 20 minutes actually. Oh, 20 minutes. Okay. I will try to focus on the last part and say and speak a little bit about or challenge the overall overarching title of our panel, Human Sciences and the Challenge of the Different Cultural Paradigms. Apparently, this seems to be perhaps clear compared to the prior, let's say, container, quote unquote, and this implies something that we mentioned in the last part, the challenge that is being waged in human sciences and alternative life forms. You said this in your introduction, alternative life forms who are fighting to be recognized as valid historic epistemological alternatives, also to then resist racism, abstractivism, white supremacism, then the patriarchy, institutional violence, in the attempt to continue with these state powers, with their secular and colonial historical domination. Bonaventura de Sousa Santos, a very famous decolonialist, at this request of recognition of other forms of life, he said recognition of cognitive pluralism, which challenges the self-centered universalism on which Eurocentric, social sciences have been shaped. This Eurocentrism that's linked to Western civilization as it has been shaped during colonial expansion. So the problem that I wanted to address is the following one, and I would like to wrap up in 2 or 3 minutes. What then has emerged more prominently in our space or wherever we deal with formation or cultural political practice regarding the issues that are related to migration and multiculturalism, what has emerged is that mainly through intercultural education and not decolonization of knowledge, it is through in this way that we can fight against bias, racism, anti-immigration sentiment, xenophobia, and therefore favoring a true multicultural integration of foreigners. And I would like to say that the idea of integration is a concept that should be challenged even more. I don't like this. We can talk about this. I had prepared something on this, by the way, but I just wanted to say this. It seems to me that if we look at it in these terms, is wrong. So not addressing the issue only as cultural. The issue is not just cultural when we talk about foreigners and the communities that coexist with us. And it would still be looking things in a colonial way, and it will not make visible this issue at the level of its social, tangible character. Think about the places that migrants and post-migrants hold in our daily lives and in our society. We'll see that the problem is not cultural, but first and foremost, it's an economic and social problem, and this is due to what can be called structural racism, through which Italian society is organized as well. What is a structural racism? It is the hierarchical differentiation of subjects and groups in society at material, economic, and social level. So a good starting point, I believe, in order to break this Eurocentric universalism that's colorblind, that shapes the most important institutional narratives in our context, would be instead if we started started to build a different anti-racist political agenda, which is not just cultural, but also looks at so-called affirmative policies that have been introduced and experimented with in other countries and that have been set aside by the anti-welfare parties in those societies as well. The interesting thing is to build a new political agenda aimed at starting from material inequality. We can say that Italian European society now is following this road for all those subjects who are not European in the colonial and traditional sense of this term. I've tried to provide you with a very fast conclusion, but I can shed further light on this. Thank you so much for having raised questions that are fundamentally important, and both in our debate today, but also tomorrow in the presentation of our project. They will be for sure mentioned by Professor Pandolfi.
So I give the floor to Professor Ilenia Camozzi. She's Associate Professor of Sociology of Culture in the Department of Social Science in the University of Milano Bicocca. Professor Camozzi teaches Sociology of Culture, Intercultural Relations and Cultures, Diversity and Conflict. She received her PhD in Applied Sociology and Research Models from the University of Milano Bicocca. In 2005, she received the second national prize for a doctoral thesis on removal of racial discrimination and prejudice. This prize also funded the publication of the book The Space of Recognition, Forms of Migratory Associationism, published by Il Mulino. The title of the paper of Professor Camozzi is Sociology and Intercultural Relations between Practices of Hegemonic Research and Critical Vision. I give you the floor. Good evening to you. I ask you if you hear me well.
Provo senza auricolari, mi sentite ora?
Can you hear me now? Yes, it is better now. I will raise the volume of my PC. So, good afternoon, everyone. A special thanks to Professor Pandolfi for this invitation and to the whole staff of the Pontifical University for the organization of this Congress. We thank the colleagues who spoke before me. I'm pleased to give a more sociological perspective, and if it was coming out, is the importance of interdisciplinarity in intercultural approach. I prepared the text to be not to fall into the problem of time. So the objective of my reflection is a thought of emancipatory potentiality of sociology, and especially the part of sociology that looks at cultural differences and the coexistence between them. This commitment requires, first of all, to question ourselves on the possibility and the ways in which reflexively the cultural differences can transform sociology. But also it requires to question ourselves on the heuristical dimension of analytical categories on which sociology built its legitimacy, take into account the geographical context of their production and the canons that were defined, whose implications in ethnocentric and essentialist terms are now more shared. To pursue this objective. I made some choices that I hope can describe the process of affirmation responsibility in a discipline that comes about from modernity and so has to face the social and cultural differentiation. So you will recall, first of all, the Weberian reflection on the categories of race and ethnic, and those of the Chicago School that made the first systemization of an analysis of race relations. And I will thematize this in relation with the thought of a neglected author who is William Dubois. This first passage enables to emphasize the problematic combination between the need for a new knowledge that focuses on the passage from community to society and its ideological basis. A second passage of my reflection is consecrated to the confrontation between the so-called Northern epistemology and the Southern epistemology. Please keep out of the microphone because we hear a lot of noises. I'll try to lower the microphone and also to go a bit farther from it. I beg your pardon. So, a second passage will be a confrontation between the epistemology of the North and the epistemologies of the South. And here I will evoke the figure. I will propose the proposal of the emancipatory sociology made by Bonaventure de Sousa Santos that Melino spoke about in guiding us in the criticism of the sociological Western imagination and its analytical distortions that seem to be the products of processes of modernization and the colonial experience. A third passage, in the wake of a pars construens of my reasoning, emphasizes the need for reflecting on the relations with the cultural differences, declining it in the plural, as Professor Zolito spoke about this aspect. So, to keep the cultural differences of ethno-racial, but also in terms of gender, age, and class, jointly considered if the objective of sociology is to be a critical discipline capable of focusing on the apparatus of dominion that rules by naturalizing them, the cultural differences, and turn them into this inequality. So the intersectional perspective is that of post-colonial feminism and will be taken up in relation to the theoretical and empirical value. And I will close by evoking the importance of a historical and reflexive sociology. Max Weber, William Dubois, and the study of race relations in the Chicago School. The choice to begin my reflection, creating a dialogue between Max Weber, Robert Park, who is the central figure of the Chicago School, and William Dubois, is dictated by the influence that those authors had, even with different times and from different places, in elaborating the sociological vision on intercultural relations. So these are three contemporary authors. Weber and Park are US citizens, Dubois is German, and their intellectual and personal pathway often crossed in the US and in Germany on their interpersonal relations and on their course of research specific on ethnic and race relations that defines the line of color. So their ethnic cultural belonging and the color of their skin. In his monumental work, Weber touched the topic of race and ethnics, especially in reference to the formation of the nation, while the racial belonging in Weber is founded on the community of origin, based on biological factors. The ethnical belonging is based on the perception, so on the subjective belief of being part of a community of origin. If the race is a category, according to Weber, that ethnic and nations are concepts whose elaboration that sociology studies. And Weber works on the line of color that in his young writings was present in reference to the Polish question. His attention was addressed to the discrimination that the white population perpetuates towards Afro-Americans and Native Americans. Motivations in the eyes of Weber are not to be attributed to anthropological differences, but to the weight of memory that anchors them in to slavery and institutionalization. Weber has interest for the studies of William Du Bois, that he met in America, and the study of Du Bois on the condition of Afro-Americans, the Philadelphia Negro, 1899, and the process of racialization contributes to increase the Weberian interest for ethnic relations and the pervasiveness of racism. Du Bois is a scholar of the intellectual biography, and the fact of being non-white was a prejudice against his scientific legitimization, both in the area of reflections on the ethnic and racial relations and about the affirmation on U.S. sociology. As Morris emphasized, that he embodies the rejected scholar in a collection of essays on the souls of black folk. Du Bois presents three key concepts of his reflection: the double conscious, the line of color, and the veil. This scholar with long-sightedness sees in the America of the 20th century the problem of the line of color that we can see in the double consciousness I'm sorry, we cannot hear. We cannot hear. So if we move a little bit or you lower the microphone, we could hear you better a few minutes ago, but please keep farther away from the microphone. Let's try again. So while in Atlanta, Du Bois combines intellectual and civic commitment in Chicago, the new rising white sociology has in the figure of Robert Parkett's Pygmalion. Despite the innovation given by many works of Du Bois, innovation also in methodological terms, he is a precursor of the mixed methods. The scholar is not listed among the founding fathers of American sociology. And we could even say that a bit older and less known Robert Parker have deliberately marginalized and excluded from the sociological canon Du Bois, who is critical to the Darwinist integrationist policy of the reconciliation between white and black, and about the process of assimilation with which Park reads the inevitable process of civilization of the European migrants in Chicago and in the US society. In the first pages of Epistemologists of the South, the Portuguese sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos clarifies that the three ideas are the basis of his reflections. First, the understanding of the world that goes much beyond the Western world of vision of the world. Second, there is no global social justice without a cognitive global justice. Third, the emancipatory transformations of the world can follow different grammars in scripture than those developed by the critical Western-centered theory. And this diversity should be valued. A sociologist engagé in the framework of anti-globalization movements, Santos starts from two assumptions. The first is that in the perspective of excluded the history of global capitalism and colonialism and patriarchy is characterized by institutionalized lies. And the second is that the epistemology of the North are supported by an Western-centered reading of the principles of justice and universalism. The epistemologies of the South have a different set than those of the North for being poor theories, theories of the retrograde that are qualified today by being by fighting against marginality and inferiority with the aim of reinforcing their capacity for resistance. The approach of Santos wants to emphasize the post-colonial and decolonial and emphasize the abyssal lines traced in the abyssal thought and this abyssal line is the border created in the colonial time that separates the form of urban metropolitan sociability from those of the colonial kind. So we have to underline how sociologists evokes the possibility for ecology of knowledge and the translation of these with a scholar studying the colonial dominion that incessantly generates abyssal exclusion. So the combination is decisive about intercultural relations, about intersectionality and post-colonial feminism that are not limited to the if you deactivate your video, maybe we can hear it better, and also take away the small microphone you had before. Yeah, I deactivate it. I'm just using the computer. So let's try without the video if it works better. I beg your pardon again. Just the audio without image. So we're saying that who's reflecting on the importance of combining the practice of research with the social movements. And here we can see the point of view on intercultural relations that is not limited to intersection, post-colonial feminism, but also looks at the dimension of gender and class. It is important just you keep just audio without video. The contestation of the Eurocentric character of social sciences, to which is associated the valuing of perspectives, overshadows perspective coming from the colonized cultures, and has in the concept of race hegemony and imperium, the outstanding points will remain in shadow, with the exception of reflections on postcolonial feminist scholars, the study on gender, and this is the reason why the proposal of Santos was criticized. The term intersectionality proposed by this scholar Kimberly Crenshaw emphasizes the multidimensionality of the experience lived by the marginalized subjects, and this approach had immediately an interest for the particular intersection of race and gender. The objective is to subvert the binomius race-gender in the service of the theorization about identity in an unprecedented way. This intersection approach came about in the season of problematization of identity politics. Crenshaw says that the real problem of identity politics is that they elude the difference between groups, a problem that intersectionality wants to solve by highlighting the differences within the great categories of women and blacks. So intersectionality tries to show the racial variation within the gender and the variation of gender within the race. The aspect of intersectional approach that we're interested the most is the invitation that he launches to displace the attention on the subjects excluded from feminist and anti-racist studies and on the impact that this exclusion has on theory and on the practice. It is the point of conjunction with postcolonial feminism that is inserted in postcolonial studies. The attention of the latter is addressed to a bottom-up history, so it is the counter-reading of the colonial history and postcolonial history of the colonized places, emphasizing the daily forms of resistance of subaltern subjects. This means to question ourselves on the way in which thought and subalternous discourse on one hand and feminist discourse on the other get in touch with each other. So we can narrate the Eastern woman, the woman of the third world, without talking about for her in her place, without condemning her to an archetype. As for the intersectional approach, postcolonial feminism wants to stimulate the hegemonic, ethnocentric, essentializing representation of academic Western discourses and their universalist agenda, including the readings of Western feminism. And I will go to my conclusions. What lesson can we learn from this pathway that emphasize the Eurocentric character of hegemonic and sociology of intercultural relations, and what horizons can we outline in terms of a commitment and responsibility addressed to democratize knowledge? I want to emphasize 2 points. The first lesson concerns the relation between sociology, history, and historiography. The historical contextualization of epistemologies and experiences of social research is crucial. Only by historically placing sociology and placing its birth and developments within the historical context, it is possible to deconstruct the theoretical postures of research and academic as universal us that we adopted as a canon. A sociological philology should be able to explain why the sociological thought was affirmed in a specific direction and ground the reflections of scholars in the historical context in which they lived. This awareness is essential to problematize the fertility of analytical instruments that is universal as we adopt in the university classes as analytical instruments of sociology, so to adopt a historical approach capable to draw from several historiographical sources that can help the problematization of sociology declined in the singular in favor of the widespreading of the support of a plural idea of this discipline that turns interdisciplinary contamination into its points of strength. And to this first point is connected the second aspect that is more methodological. How can we decolonize knowledge if the awareness of the ethical value of a plural knowledge with several voices is what moves many scholars who study the intercultural relations and the combinations that are at stake in the complexity of the relations? Then we cannot invert the march of the practice of research. So the key concept is reflexivity. By recurring times, Alberto Melucci at the end of the 90s, looking at the effects of the so-called cultural turning point of social science, wrote that reflexive sociology experiences methods of research and their application, often enthusiastic, but they call into question the basic assumptions of the positivist tradition of the scientific investigation. So for reflexive sociology, what is central is the language and the awareness of non-neutrality, and it is decisive to rethink the relation of those who observe and their field, now unthinkable outside of a relationship of mutual influence and sharing of roles. So, to which reflexive sociology involves bonds that we should read with a crucial intervention about the topic of intercultural relations. Reflexivity generates a reflexivity potentially in an infinite vortex, and the multiplicity of interpretation paradigms can silence them instead of giving them voice. And in this risks and limit, we can see and grasp the construct character of the practice of research, to which is connected a specific responsibility towards the protection of knowledge and the intersubject daily relations of the differences. I'm sorry for these technical problems. Thank you, Professor Camozzi. So there were problems, but maybe we grasped the meaning of what you wanted to tell us. But maybe we have an opportunity to read the text when it will be published. So thank you very much.
Now I would like to give the floor, and she's physically here. Yay. I would like to give the floor to Professor Cristina Zavaroni, who is sitting right here next to me. She's an anthropologist from the Mamre Foundation and the Mondi Multipli Laboratory of the Department of Education Sciences of the University of Genoa. Professor Zavaroni obtained a PhD in psychology, anthropology, and cognitive sciences from the University of Genoa. She has also a master's degree in ethnomedicine and ethnopsychiatry, health research, and interventions in multicultural contexts. And she also has a degree in cultural anthropology at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She supports research in medical anthropology and ethnopsychiatry at the Mondi Multipli Laboratory and the Mamre Foundation in Turin, which is a non-profit foundation, where she works with the Center for Psychological and Ethnopsychiatric Support for Migrants. She's a member and reference person for training activities at the UNESCO Chair in Health Anthropology at the University of Genoa. And she is co-author of several publications in both international and national journals. The title of her contribution is the following: Descriptive Models and Operational Models Between Social Sciences and Ethnopsychiatry. The floor is yours. Thank you, Professor. Would like to thank you all, but especially for having given me this opportunity to basically place my contribution in a progression of social science contributions that I find extremely interesting. I would like to thank Professor Pandolfi. Today, I would like to perhaps convey less concepts to you. My presentation will not be as rich in theory as other presentations today, but I would like to move on to practice. And I will rely on my daily experience as a formator, sharing with you what aims I need to reach in formations, because formation is, for me, very useful, because these are the formators I will be working with in the ethnoclinical context. So very quickly, I would like to describe to you what an ethnoclinical context is, and ethnopsychiatry that I refer to, at least the terms in which I understand, the way in which I understand this term here in Rome, or in general, the people I work with. By ethnopsychiatry, we refer to a complementary tool used in a clinical, medical, psychological, psychiatric context, but it's used also in social context as well. Every time social services, for instance, or institutions encounter users that have a different, let's say, social and cultural background, then the institution might not be able to reach the targets that it's set for itself. They are typical of its mandate. It can happen to a social worker, to a physician, to a psychiatrist. It can happen very frequently with teachers. Therefore, we refer to an ethnopsychiatric, let's say, solution when teachers or physicians have already tried, basically, to reach their goals, but they were not effective in doing so. Patients perhaps suffer from, let's say, a situation, it could be a disease, a sense of malaise, but the discomfort is something that is not being explained. And it seems as if the diagnostic tools that we have available are not helping us in identifying an effective therapy. Or perhaps the family of the child or teenager that we're dealing with is not able to interface with the school system effectively. Or maybe we're talking about social services that must come to grip with the structural and social complexity that is not equipped to deal with, basically. I'm here as a cultural anthropologist, but I'm also an ethnoclinical mediator. Therefore, I work directly in trying to help all these people in solving the problems that are affecting them. I'm doing so within a theological and methodological framework of ethnopsychiatry, which, as I was mentioning earlier, it's a complementary tool that's been used that requires also because of political reasons as well, to juxtapose disciplinary approaches from subjects that focus on processes affecting individual persons. I could say individuals, but in this case, anthropology is focusing on the individual. I want to avoid using individual because in anthropology it has a specific meaning. We could talk about what giving up the notion of individual implies, as considering individual as synonymous with person. So basically, we help professionals who are dealing with processes that involve individuals, and also in professionals who deal with the processes involving groups. Anthropologists, jurists, teachers, those who deal with processes rather than let's say, embodiments or incarnations. And these are very different, let's say, approaches that highlight activities that cannot be integrated easily. But in the ethnopsychiatric context, we always need to juxtapose the expertise and the know-how of these groups that come into contact, not just the subjects that I listed earlier, the ones that I listed earlier, which are all subjects that are being taught in Western universities. And we need to also include the know-how and knowledge and expertise of others, quote unquote, irrespective of who the others are. The real others who are meeting on the ethnopsychiatric stage, the patient and his reference family or his reference group, the care system or systems that these people might refer to, the pupil and his specific notion of disability, that of his or her family, that of all those who have come up with a diagnosis. So we need to establish a dialogue between these different players and constructs. And we have to do so making sure that all these elements have enjoy the same status. In order to form workers, social workers, teachers, etc., who are willing to deal with this multiplicity of situations and players, I need to expose the formes to this multiplicity, and I do so in the easiest way I have available, i.e., by using as formators my colleagues in Turin and Genoa, who have a different anthropopoietic, let's say, approach. This was proposed initially by Francesco Remotti, and by this we tend to refer to the fact our species, the human species, needs to impose a shape, a form, a project-making approach to each individual human being, because our species does not have a given form, a specific adult form that is given on an a priori basis. This fact itself leaves us, both in theory and in practice, or actually allows us to grasp that anthropopoietic processes, cultural processes, can give radically different outcomes, and therefore I need learners to deal with cultural processes in which by cultural we're not just thinking of naturalizing the notion of culture, but today we have to understand each other without infinite, let's say, definitions and clarifications. So they have to deal with real processes that might be radically different from one another. As an example of a radically different process, I might refer to something that's very trivial, perhaps. For instance, the fact that in the societies where looking at each other in the eye is a fundamental element in the bond that is established by mother and child, between mother and child, they build intersubjectivity, the relational aspect, and the idea itself of the self and others in a way that is significantly different compared to those society in which the relational element does not go through the gaze, let's say, looking at each other. We might say a lot of things about this, and I'm not suggesting that there are people who look at each other in the eye and others who don't. I imagine that there are 6,000 different ways of doing that, but once again, we need to, of course, simplify things. Just to give you an idea of these radical differences, already this beginning in our lives that is so different has an impact on the neurological and cognitive plane and the perception of discourse and speech. And this is very interesting. However, these elements that I need to place in a dialogue that is absolutely democratic are not actually then found in the world around us I can think of the right word, but it was used so many times. The symmetrical, okay, the symmetrical position. I didn't tell the professor that I'm a dyslexic. If the words are not written down in front of me, I cannot think of them. So thank you for having suggested this. But basically, constantly, all the processes are embodied in human beings, and this is located in implicit hierarchies. I'm doing my best to move away from the hierarchy and trying to have each one's principles and values on an equal footing. And I was in Aosta yesterday for a training session together with a mediator and a psychologist, and I needed to ask the other mediator, the colleague I was helping, to talk about a specific social cultural process that she represented in a way, using her own way of expressing things and her own contents. But in doing so, I know very well that I am exposing my colleague to a gaze, to a scrutiny that is very cumbersome. I'm actually exposing otherness to a scrutiny that is described in a remarkable way. It was described in 1952 by Frantz Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks. And I find myself in a situation of choosing how to intervene. So I might try not to put myself in yet another, I have to find the word. It's not too far away. I know. So I'm trying not to put myself each and every time in the situation that's patronizing of, let's say, let's say, superior that sanctions the inferior or legitimizes the inferior. This is what has been happening between whites and blacks, and not just in North America. In the post-colonial English language also we have the notion of brown. I do not want to put myself in that situation, because I then always refer to the same hierarchical system. But if I do not do so, then I exposed my counterpart to an experience of potential existential deconstruction. The fact is that the game that is being played within an educational institution is always the game decided by the institution. The educational institution, by definition, is a Western and so Eurocentric institution. Many attempts were made, not just attempts, but also the tangible practices that have been introduced. I'm thinking about the very interesting work of Michael Singleton from the Catholic University of Louvain. He's an anthropologist, and he criticizes very effectively Eurocentrism. And he is a scholar who has been intentionally imbibed by therapeutic system and cultural processes of the Wakanungo culture in Tanzania. He found himself in the situation of speaking about others with the knowledge and competence of the white man. And until now, his attempt has been that of avoiding of being in a position of legitimizing somebody else. And ethnopsychiatry, luckily enough, is quite helpful. First of all, yesterday afternoon, during this training session in Aosta, while my colleague was sharing contents were completely out of sync from the ones that were being then handled by the supervision group, and another trainee, a mediator, raised her hand. And she said, well, I'm working on this specific case that you're talking about. I would have wanted to talk about this, but I cannot do that because I do not travel with an anthropologist as a bodyguard with me, and I said to myself, thank you. This is the kind of communication that I would like to share with my audience here. So in order for contents to be brought and acquired and implemented, we constantly need to build a meta framework of legitimization that states that the rules of the game have to do with multiplicity. Well, of course, this is not easy to do. This is not easy to do for several reasons. Because it's not always easy, actually, quite often it is quite difficult to imagine what is basically the impact of our gaze on other people. And now I imagine that I still have a few minutes left, however, because I'm rushing through my presentation basically. But ethnopsychiatry, ever since it has been used in practice, it hasn't been for too long. Let's say that we started using ethnopsychiatry in clinical practice only with Georges Devereux in the 1950s. So it hasn't been a long time that we've been doing this. But starting from Georges Devereux's several seminal works, we are starting to deal with an additional element in addition to traditional therapy, psychotherapy. And I'm sure that you are familiar with the contemporary psychotherapeutic tools, which usually do not, they think that relationship has a healing power, and if the relationship it has a healing power, then it has to go through a transfer and counter-transfer mechanism. Ethno-psychiatric reflection adds one more layer, stating that once an individual meets another individual, the kind of relationship that is being established is made by transfer and counter-transfer, and the therapeutic, let's say, imbalance requires someone to manage this. But once what we are dealing with is a plurality of cultural constructions or constructs, then it is more interesting to focus on the effects of the cultural counter-transfer. The cultural counter-transfer, however, is an experience that is qualitatively similar to that of transferred and counter-transferred. But in theory, and essentially, although I do not like using this word normally, it's completely other. For cultural counter-transfer, we mean the effect that our construction of the other generates within us when we meet the other. Be careful here. I'm not talking about the effect that the other has on us, but it is the effect that what we know, sometimes we're right, we might be wrong, quite often we're wrong, what we know about the other generates within us once we meet the other. So here, we're not talking about transferred and counter-transferred as the, let's say, two-way street between the therapist and patient and vice versa. But with cultural counter-transfer, we mean this situation in whatever circumstance, not just in the relationship between therapist and patient. So each and every time, a great Italian ethnopsychiatrist says this quite often, Roberto Beneduce, every time we meet somebody else clinically, we are meeting this person for the first time, but this person knows you already. So if this person knows you already, then his or her construction of who you are generates an effect in him or her that is as significant as the actual person, which is you in this case. It's like a mirror kind of process, a mirroring process. my proposal, which is empirically very simple, my proposal that I transfer from my practice as a clinician and as a formator and as a social worker, is that of using the cultural countertransfer once we structure and put into practice the educational or formative instances that are aimed at preserving plurality. There is no need to equip yourself with a cultural countertransfer tool when, starting from cultural construction plurality, we want to get to integration. Earlier, someone already talked about the possibility of integration as a term that needs to be once again challenged and we discussed, and I'm very happy about this. And I would like to suggest that this is something that we can talk about together in the next few minutes if we have any left. But today, basically, my intention was that of asking you to see what happens when, at the idea of contents and the notion of form or shape, we add the embodied element of the assessment of the effect that the social cultural construction of the other, hypothetical effect, that this has on us once we meet the other. We might say that my suggestion, my proposal, is that of moving away. We have to move away from indifference in order to move towards difference. But then we have to embrace a passion for difference as an element that is not protective to fill.
Bene, grazie professoressa, ci ha dato anche...
Thank you, Professor. You gave us many suggestions, as was the case of the other professors. So I ask Professor Pandolfi, considering that we only have 5 minutes, so we just have 2 or 3 questions. Okay, so we have time, approximately 10 minutes for 2 or 3 questions in the room or from online participants, but it is better in the Aula Magna. Questions to Professor Melino, to Professor Camozzi, and please don't be afraid. We are vegetarian, we shall not eat you up. We prefer cereals, fruits, and vegetables. Don't be afraid. A practical example. You couldn't hear anything of the question. Anyway, I am an Italian woman and I am a mother. In the Italian construction of mom, there is a basic content. There is only one mom. And in my specific case, I am the mother of my daughter. So, several years ago, I was working in a microclinical tip with a psychotherapist and a mediator, and we were working on the issues of a mom and her child, of a different cultural origin. She was a person with a profession that is very Western and very post-colonial. So someone with whom the discourse was fluent and very comfortable and very easy. She was from a country of sub-Saharan Africa. This lady told us that she was living on her own with her boy in a city of northern Italy. This boy heard from his teachers, and this boy was very, very angry. Useless to discuss, as you saw, a 6-year-old boy in Italy. Very angry. So we could imagine what happened in the classroom. This lady told us a few things, including that for healthy reasons, she did not feel like sending her boy to the kindergarten in that city, because it was not possible to guarantee to this boy in the kindergarten, local kindergarten, that he was treated in the most appropriate way. So she chose to send her boy to be with her older sister. The boy remained 2 years in another city of Europe with his maternal aunt. But when the lady told me and to the other psychotherapist that the boy was sent when he was 4 years old somewhere else, well, for us, we had a crisis with the idea of the mother, but I didn't have a crisis with my mother, which is a classical proto-transfer phenomenon, because something moves in me of unresolved concerning my relationship with my mother, and so I live an emotional experience concerning my mother, connected to my mother. No, what became suffering was a cultural mother, in my idea of cultural mother, the fact that there is only one mother. I am Africanist, and I was also in presence of a mediator, linguistic cultural mediator, who said, Christina, my colleague, psychotherapist, and said, let's, hold on, because in the system of the family system of this lady, mother is a name that describes several positions in a genealogical tree, and there is not only one mother. Someone could say these children are lucky for this. There are at least as many mothers as at least as many sisters she has, and the first sister is the ideal mother for the children of all the sisters of this family. So from this point of view, this lady, as she was not able to express the best of motherhood that she felt necessary for her boy, she sent him to the best mother of all. So if we didn't have make the passage of choral elaboration of this cultural counter-transfer, then something would happen to us that would produce a suffering. In this case, in the classical theorization, the cultural counter-transfer moves in a continuum that goes from fascination to aversion, total opposition, and we were rather in the area of suffering, while What a Beautiful Boy Has a Music in His Blood is a classical example of a cultural fascination, cultural counter-transfer in the area of fascination. So if we didn't make this passage of distinguishing our subjective element from the element of construction in ourselves of a cultural category, we wouldn't have a good capability of spending on a clinical level that insight and say, look, this lady and this boy, because of the processes, migratory processes, are constructed by cultural processes of mother that are very different. It's not very common that a mother and a child are built by two cultural conception mothers that are different, but in this case, this is what was happening. So a child that was made by Italian concept of mother found himself launched into a system where the mother was not only one, but there are many of them. So being able to bring this movement into the clinical session enabled this woman to reposition herself, but also to reconceptualize the phenomena that were taking place in her own family within a geopolitical perception that was much wider. So this is a clearly cultural example that had many effects. It enabled everyone, first of all, to say, hold on, let us legitimize the fact that we are not trying to insert this family into the psychoanalytic model of reference. No, we're trying to place this family into a need for co-constructing the operational concepts while taking the distance from the cognitive concepts that we typically use in the social science, if we can insert psychotherapy in the social science and taking them out of the healthcare area. Thank you very much. We have something that unites what Professor said with Professor Melillo, which is the attempt to categorize the term integration. Maybe some colleagues would be happy about hearing this problematization, beginning with Professor Melino, if he is online. Good evening, Professor Melino. So before speaking, I want to say one thing. There is a question up there. Just a moment. I'll let him reply, and then I'll come back to you. Professor Melino, I said something that I think also Professor Camozzi has very clear, as she's a scholar of Du Bois, because I think that we should look more at the traditional radical Black American thought and also other Afro-Caribbean thoughts that for a long time since the birth of political and theoretical practice that was called into question this idea of integration, because the integration supposes something that is ready to welcome something that was excluded, and it is enough to recognize it in order to welcome it and accept it. So if we want to call the story of anti-racism or fights of the colonial groups, of indigenous, of the slaves, of the blacks in the US, of migrants in Europe, says the opposite. It says that these communities, as they're excluded with their subjectivization, they opened a space and a grammar of rights that did not exist before. So they did not integrate, they furtherly enlarged, if we can say that, the space and the grammar of existing rights. So Delibara explains that well in a book called Citizenship, how the borders of citizenship in a way have always been widened, enlarged by the fight of those who were excluded. So there is no integration to something, because that thing is already lacking in itself. We leave it also in what is happening in Italy and what is happening concerning the political dialectics, institutional dialectics of ius soli, and everything that has to do with the right to citizenship. So the idea that this word integration should be demystified, because it supposes something that in reality does not exist. So it is a simple ideology of the state-nation. It is not its material reality. So this could be the connection with something that I try to say, which is a criticism I want to do to what has been said, what I heard in the panel. I agree with all the approaches, so nothing to say. They are part of my personal pathway, but the problem is that I'm afraid that we are reasoning on the dematerialized background that does not take into account the asymmetries, material and real asymmetries that are manifest in society. So we are talking about something that works despite of all these. So in my intervention, what I wanted to say is that from my point of view, to go towards a recognition and equality that is more substantial, more than formal, and also intended in the multicultural, intercultural way, we should innovate the political agenda anti-racist, also according to this question, this idea with concepts that make visible the real situation of most foreigners, of that 11% of foreigners living in Italy. So these concepts are cultural racism, cultural institutionalism, segregation, institutional segregation. So we should work on an agenda and an anti-racist approach starting from this. Otherwise, we will see the problem in cultural integration, but the problem is elsewhere. So I simplified because there is no time, but I will begin with this. Do you want to add something, and then we'll hear the question? Yes, a great Italian psychiatrist who left us a few months ago, Piero Coppo, when it was about integration and discussing why he was not a friend of the term integration. He made a drawing, I don't know if you can see it, but basically he drew a big fish that was the hegemonic culture that integrates a small fish, but eventually you know where the little fish goes, ends up going. So, and he proposed another term that was had an extraordinary impact in many areas of psychiatric research. I'm thinking of the experience of articulation between conventional medicine and traditional medicine. For example, and in this case he drew mechanisms, cogs, where to articulate means to be able to add a small cog. But you know that if you add a cog to a system, you add an engine of energy that is very important. So the kind of alternative to integration that in psychiatry we can think of is an idea of articulation. But in order to articulate something, you need that that entity subsists. So the risk of integration is that to melt the gradients of multiplicity, of otherness. So shifting from similarity to identity, whereby identity, I mean, refer to the theoretical use made by Francesco Ramotti, who says, let's leave the idea of identity, which is the similar with the sign equal. Let's move in the area of gradients and similitude and differences, so that we are not forced to think in oppositional terms. Thank you. Okay, the question up there. No, it was not a question. When we spoke, I saw the moment of the void. I said, let's fill this gap. And eventually it was not needed because the conversation followed, but I wanted to take the chance to say a few things. The first is that I was very satisfied for being here this afternoon because I lived a pathway about the issue of otherness and integration in a multidisciplinary way, in a concrete way. And I want to make a few considerations, if I may. So the last paper was about ethnopsychiatry. I remember that the founder of this discipline, if I get it right, was called Stubinata. He was a person of reference, very important, 25 years ago. Then the problems came up that were evoked about language. For us African, the word ethno created problems for many time. Ethnopsychology, ethnophilosophy, ethnoanthropology, etc. For obvious reasons, for everything that in the 19th century anthropology or ethnoanthropology meant. So when Professor intervened, he built the title saying that we had to revise the words for them to have a meaning. So if we had to revise the words to give them a meaning, this is also we have to revise other words because the type of communication we do with Africans, Asians, and Latin American can earn a meaning of dialogue because the word ethno is historically filled with a connotation of discrimination, and we should surpass it. The second thing, I'm satisfied to see that authors are quoted as usual are not mentioned, like Dubois is an author of 1903, and Black Folks, Souls. He is compared with Parker or Max Weber, who went to school together, but Dubois is usually not mentioned, and that is extraordinary. But once more, I think that we Africans who work in philosophy, African philosophy, we get interested in Dubois and Black Souls as the one who organized all the Pan-African Congresses from 19 to 1945. And then they went to a process of negritude. So this brings me to thank a professor who invited me, because I want to say this. This ongoing dialogue is very important because many suggestions and reflections that were made here can be very useful as hints of epistemological reflections that are very important in discussions, not only Afro-American discussions, but also Afro-African discussions. But especially there is a sentence by a North American writer, Afro-American, who said that only 30 seconds. He said that the heart of the black heart began to beat in Harlem. And they often say the heart of the black world beats in Bahia, Brazil, because there is a place where reflection about Africanity from the epistemological point is very alive, is Bahia. The third issue, that conclusion, is the one of epistemology of the North and the South that was evoked by Boaventura dos Santos, not for reasons of mentioning one more name, but there is an epistemological debate in Africa, very interesting and very lively, that taking the hint and going beyond Boaventura dos Santos to be interesting to take it up. So I say all this because I think that the dialogue North-South, here the University Urbaniana, once more, thanks to the organizers, should have the courage to organize, to discuss more with the protagonists of the thought of those countries, that not only do what we have been doing here, but they often have other perspectives and they go beyond the assumptions I said here. So here in Dubois of 1903 is good, but the number of critical texts that came about in the last 50 years would deserve to be known and discussed by Africans. Thank you. Thank you very much. So on this note of thanks, we want to close this afternoon session. May I say one thing, only 1 minute? I'm Melino. 1 minute. I don't want to make a polemics on Remotti, but the idea that we have to abandon identity does not convince me, because I think it is a position, the position of abandoning the identity from an identity that is already legitimized. So it is, in simple terms, why a Mapuche should forget about his cultural identity, or why most of the oppressed people denied by the history of colonialism, racism, and slavery should forget about their history and should forget or put in parentheses their cultural identity, which was created along this history. I think it is a philosophical position or epistemological position that could seem a bit equalitarian or open to others, but as a matter of fact, it should be problematized, at least from my point of view. Thank you, Professor Melino. There are a few questions. So, yeah, we still have 10 minutes. So, Tiziana Longhitano.
Prego, Tiziana.
Ecco, intanto vi ringrazio.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for this panel. You have basically been complementary to each other. So this afternoon and this morning, we really, the panels were excellent. A very quick question. In 2007, I was in New York City, and I was there for the celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation, let's say. It was the anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And there, the United Nations were asking us not to use the term race any longer. I'm wondering, however, whether this request has now become part of the language of human sciences and social sciences that you are discussing here. And if this is the case, how was this, let's say, a recommendation greeted? Well, every time that someone says the word natural family, an anthropologist dies. There was like a joke. And the current joke now is every time someone uses the word race, an anthropologist dies. That's the updated version of the joke. In cultural and biological anthropology in Europe, for the most part, the term race has lost any kind of legitimacy in terms of, let's say, of biological and knowledge standpoint. So from an ethological and biological standpoint, the race category does not add any level of knowledge when it's referred to the term species. However, this does not solve at all the political significance of the racial theme today. And I agree with the professor who said, let's try to quote something that's a little bit more recent than 1952 or 1903. I totally agree with that. But today, perhaps not in Harlem, but all over the United States, feeling a racial identity on oneself, it is a daily and an embodied experience, and eliminating the conceptual category just for, let's say, to have a purist stance in our subject, I believe does not really benefit anyone. I cannot say the word race or write it anywhere, but I do realize, because, by the way, I'm constantly exchanging messages and letters with movements in the United States. It's a category that is still needed, just like identity is a very powerful category, just to mention one category. Since Francesco Remotti was evoked, I feel I need to react. When he talks about identity, the risk he sees is the same risk that has been highlighted so effectively by the category of ethnicity. It can be an ethnic and race-fine category, identity, I mean, and we do not need this. Just one word to explain why we're still using this term, ethnopsychiatry. Well, because the alternative is transcultural psychiatry or psychology. The problem is that, not really since the time of Tubinatan, but if we consider Georges Devereux, but he was the let's say, master of Tubinatan. They used to use these terms indiscriminately. But in France, at some point, these processes became diversified. And by ethnopsychiatry, we mean then in order to treat Suke, the soul, the spirit, Atreya, we must become aware of the fact that there is no spirit or vital, let's say, spirit or relational cognitive process, if not within a specific construction. And by ethnos, here, we mean every single social, cultural process, but not in identity-based reification. And in this sense, on the other hand, transcultural psychiatry moved along the lines of referring to a greater theorization, mostly psychoanalysis, and trying to find a way to locate its effects for every social process. In a way, I'm more passionate about the idea of multiplicity that leads to the ugly term ethnopsychiatry. That's not pretty to hear, but who cares that you're passionate about about this, someone might say. But myself and the authors I refer to, compared to the hegemonic notion that there is an explanatory model that works for everything, we have to understand the local way for an explanation to be provided and take hold. The very last question, and then we're done. Well, a comment was made off the mic, but the reply is, I feel safe anyhow. So we don't know why she's feeling safe. But we thank you all. We would like to thank all our speakers and hope that we will see you soon in person. I would like to thank Professor Zavarone, Professor Camozzi, and Professor Zolito. But mostly, I would like to thank you all for your perseverance and your patience. We will see you all tomorrow morning at 8:30. I wish you a pleasant evening, bon appétit, and a good night, everybody.
Grazie.